Vanilla WoW is one of the most beloved versions of World of Warcraft, and it has pretty much been mined for content for the past 2 decades to flesh out retail's expansion. From the Burning Crusade to Wrath of the Lich King to Cataclysm, and pretty much every expansion after that, it has been finishing off the OG storylines and story beats. So let's take a deep look into some of these OG storylines back how they were meant to be in vanilla. And in this particular case, we're going to discuss 5 raids that ended up becoming different things in future expansions. Actually, this very first one was completely scrapped and never really utilized. And that is the Stormwind Vault. Actually, that's a mild lie. The Stormwind Vault was eventually turned into the Violet Hold, a Dalaran-themed dungeon, but it pretty much copied the OG story beats of what Stormwind Vault was meant to be, scaled it down a lot, and then made it into the Violet Hold dungeon. But let's discuss the OG Stormwind Vault. What exactly was it meant to be? And why did the devs choose to scrap it? Now, initially, the Vault was meant to be a larger version of the Stockade. It was meant to house more dangerous and violent creatures in comparison to the Stockades. It was meant to be larger, bigger, more terrifying, and much more dangerous. Now, one of the reasons the devs have stated for cutting Stormwind Vault was because it was a bit too ambitious for the vanilla time frame. They ended up running out of time to really complete it and give it the love it deserved, and they wanted to focus more on outdoor content and raids and locations outside of cities, because they didn't want to make city-based content that was isolated or limited to a faction. Now, I don't know how much I necessarily believe that it didn't really fit with the game. They could have made a teleporter for the Horde, or a Horde version of the exact same dungeon. Would have been different assets, but the dungeon and raid would have played out exactly the same way. But again, in vanilla, there was so much scrap content that it makes sense that the devs just ran out of time. But some of the creatures that were meant to be ended up getting placed in future editions of the game, for example, Cataclysm and onward. For example, the Tol Barad raid as well is also somewhat a copy and change of the Stormwind Vault raid. I don't know exactly what kind of demons, monsters, orcs, or whatnot were kept imprisoned down here. Those ideas are pretty much lost to time, and any idea that the developers originally had is left in some scrap notebooks or in the heads of some people that clearly remember their original intentions and design concepts. But in my opinion, based off the Tol Barad raid as well as the Violet Hold, I expect this to have had some kind of big, monstrous demon creature still in the middle, corrupted nobles or people imprisoned by Onyxia, because she was Lady Katrana Presta, put people in jail. You know, there would have been a whole storylines of freeing the falsely imprisoned individuals, getting their help, overthrowing Lady Katrana Presta, the whole shebang. There's so many ways they could have combined it into the overarching human storyline. Now, I personally think that Stormwind Vault should make some form of comeback in some kind of context. The asset's already there, Stormwind Vault is already finished, and multiple private servers have already completely fleshed out and filled out this raid concept. It wouldn't be, or I should clarify, it shouldn't be that difficult to flesh it out with unique assets, especially now that the Classic dev team has access to the art team. But this isn't a Classic Plus video, I make plenty of them as is. So we're going to move on to the next scrapped raid, and that is the Amberhorn Caverns. Now, most of you have probably never actually heard the name Amberhorn Cavern, but most of you have heard of Hyjal. Now, Hyjal is not just a raid, it's a whole ass zone. It's large, it's amazing, all quotation marks, should be amazing if done properly, but it was fully fleshed out and there was a ginormous corpse of Archimonde at the center underneath Nordrassil. Hyjal, as we know in vanilla, was completely scrapped and essentially completely redone in Cataclysm. They also did utilize some of the original ideas and plans in TBC, with the TBC raid for the Siege of Hyjal, but that was merely an adaptation of the OG ideas for Hyjal. So what exactly was Hyjal meant to be, or in this context, what was the Amberhorn Cavern meant to be? Now, I've essentially gone through as many notes and files and dev interviews and just random dev blogs and Twitch streams from several devs who have talked about the ancient past of vanilla. And according to most people, the Amberhorn Caverns, or the concept of the Amberhorn Caverns, was essentially some kind of barrow den. It was meant to be similar to Illidan's prison in context. Now, I'm not sure if Illidan's prison and the Amberhorn Cavern was meant to be the same raid location dungeon, but those ideas are very old. So, the Amberhorn Cavern, like I said, some form of barrow den. It was meant to be underneath Hyjal. There was meant to be demons in there. There was meant to be wardens in there, ancient, slumbering, corrupted druids and such, as well as old god themes and remnants of the Night Elf Empire. Now, again, completely scrapped and was never brought back. Well, to a degree, In Legion, we did get Surama and some remnants of that ancient Night Elf Empire, but Amberhorn Cavern was meant to be a more ruined version of that essentially. Deep underneath Kalimdor, the remnants of a dark, mysterious, bloody path and future of the Night Elves. Now, I personally kind of prefer the idea of Amberhorn Caverns and the OG vanilla storyline over what happened in TBC and onwards. The devs have said that they were very ambitious in their original plans for Hyjal and what they wanted to do. Amberhorn Cavern has very little information left about it, so anything I say or anything you find online is essentially, oh, it was meant to be a raid of some sort, but we just ran out of time. But I'm curious into what the OG idea and intentions were for this original version. Sadly, we'll never know, but perhaps in the future, again, not a Classic Plus video, they may revisit and finish some of these original ideas because Chris Metzen is back and maybe he still has his OG notes for Kalimdor and what the plans for Hyjal was. So who knows, maybe those notes still exist. Moving on from the Amberhorn Caverns, which was a theoretical concept that got completely abandoned, let's move on to something that got very heavily reused, and that is Karazhan. Now, Karazhan's original intention was much grander than anybody really realizes. It was meant to have two levels, Upper Karazhan Tower and Lower Karazhan Tower. But on top of that, we have Karazhan Crypts. So these three locations were all meant to be interconnected to some degree. Now, we have some images of OG Karazhan and what it was meant to look like, and as you guys can see, for the most part, it's just excessive. So many layers, so many floors, there would be way too many bosses, just like BRD was drastically too big to be a dungeon and they essentially cut half of it in Cataclysm. The same thing essentially happened with Karazhan Tower's complete idea. They ended up trimming it down more and more and more, and by the time TBC came around, what we had left was just a 10-man raid because the original idea was just way too much resource intensive. So let's discuss some of these OG ideas for Karazhan. And some of the designers have said previously that Karazhan was meant to have multiple bosses, way more than we actually got, as well as having multiple levels that even connected to other dimensions and realms that Medivh had traversed and studied. Now, this is a small glimpse into what could have been because I'm not exactly sure what the story beats would have been. What kind of dimensions would we have been accessing? Would these have been demon realms or things of that nature? Would they have been magical, unique little pockets of reality that were just different? And for those of you that have read John Statz's book about the design of vanilla World of Warcraft, you completely understand just how ambitious Karazhan Crypts were, as well as Karazhan Tower proper. Now, I hope someday the devs release a full-on video or maybe a World of Warcraft deep dive where they explain some of these OG ideas in detail, because the Karazhan we got is a fraction of what it was originally meant to be. Now, again, beating a dead horse, and I've said this after every single point so far, but in Classic Plus, finishing off these ideas would be a very interesting and innovative way to bring that vanilla world more and more life. Again, not a Classic Plus video. So let's move on to the next topic. Now, before I talk about Uldum in Classic and Vanilla, I do want to clarify one thing. The Uldum we got in Cataclysm was also a scrap version of a secondary Uldum. The Uldum we got in Cataclysm was essentially an Indiana Jones-esque bullshittery. But before I deep dive the vanilla storyline, let's talk about the original Cataclysm storyline. In Cataclysm, the Taurens and stuff were meant to go into Uldum and discover images and statues and things based off the Tauren goddesses and Tauren gods. Now, these would have included the Sunwalkers, which would have helped Taurens unlock their Paladin storyline and belief. Now, I'm not sure about all the exact storylines, but you can look on Twitter, you can find them on forums and whatnot, that the OG storyline was much darker, much more hopeful at the same time, and expanded upon the Tauren lore in a way that was genuinely necessary. The Taurens, much like the Trolls, are the red-headed stepchild of the World of Warcraft universe, and they keep getting their lore butchered for no reason other than someone else has to shine right now, so you have to suffer so they shine. Now that we know that Uldum has two scrap storylines, let's go back to vanilla Uldum and what it was meant to be. Now, based on some OG data and information and dev interviews we found about Uldum's original design, it was meant to be an underground city, not above ground zone. So it was meant to be this big Titan facility that was meant to be kind of split up into multiple locations, a raid, a dungeon or two, an area you can actually explore. You're meant to open the gates to Uldum and go downstairs. Much like how Karazhan is an open world location, but there's nothing in there. So even if you manage to glitch yourself into Karazhan, it's just a completely empty location. Unless you go through the portal, in which case it turns into a raid. Uldum was meant to be the same. Now, the OG Uldum was scrapped pretty early on, they just did not have enough time. They started with both Eastern Kingdoms and Kalimdor's drawings and plans, but they didn't start developing Kalimdor until the Eastern Kingdom was finished. And that sucks a bit because a lot of the scrap story beats are from Kalimdor, not as much from Eastern Kingdoms. But essentially, imagine Ulduman scaled up to 10, a bigger version, because the Ulduman storyline essentially sends you to Uldum, and it's meant to unlock and begin the Uldum story arc. They may have intended to introduce this as a patch later on, but the devs have essentially said that they spent close to a decade working on Uldum before they finally managed to get the version we got in Cataclysm. So perhaps in another timeline, another reality, we would have gotten a different version of Uldum earlier, but it just never happened. What kind of Uldum would you have liked to see? I'm actually curious. Did people like the Cataclysm version of Uldum? Now though, we are going to go onto a place that people have essentially been clamoring for so goddamn long, it's insane. And that is Batol. Now, Batol happened to become a thing in Cataclysm, but it was not done just as well. Because Batol was essentially taken from being a little location, a big ass tower with an underground chasm and location, into becoming a zone, the Twilight Highlands. And they took a lot of the Batol story arcs and themes and spread it across the zone, the Bastion of Twilight, and all of those shenanigans. And it was honestly done a disservice. Batol should have honestly been a giant Blackrock Mountain-esque location with multiple floors, multiple dungeons, multiple raids. It should have been this iconic masterpiece that it was meant to be. I'm not going to talk about Cataclysm because the Twilight Highlands and all those story beats in Cataclysm were actually really cool, and the devs did do a good job. Just Batol being a single 5-person dungeon is honestly a mild point of embarrassment in my opinion. Now, let's talk about the OG Batol as a raid. What was it meant to be? How was it meant to look? Now, in the vanilla setting, Batol's lore and story is already very expansive. I'm not even going to talk about Xalatath and all that stuff that's been added back into it. But essentially in vanilla and the old lore, the dwarves had the Dwarven Empire fracture, civil war shenanigans happen, whole bunch of characters, A, B, C, yada yada yada. I'm very summarizing everything because the story of the Dwarven Wars is very long, and I don't want to do a 2-hour video on Dwarven lore right now. But essentially, the Dark Iron Dwarves end up sacking Batol by usage of Dark Old God magics, which end up making Batol inhospitable and inhabitable by every single person. So where do the Wildhammer Dwarves go? They go north and make Airy Peak. They make a whole new city and livelihood up north. But Batol essentially gets abandoned. Then comes the Second War. So the Second War, the Orcs come down there, they find the Demon Soul, they capture Alexstrasza, they enslave the Red Dragonflight. Then that's why the Orcs have red dragons in Warcraft 2 and 3 and whatnot. But then, you know, the Orcs lose in the Second War, the Red Dragons are freed, Alexstrasza in her anger seals off Batol, leaves it a locked off location, filled with a lot of dragons and orcs and the darkness, and just so many more story beats that just combining Batol into what it was meant to really be would have essentially been a Blackrock Mountain-esque situation. A multifaceted, multi-instance, multi-storyline-esque mega location. Sadly, they ran out of time. And that is a recurring theme in vanilla WoW. They ran out of time and then they finished all this stuff in future expansion. But man, I wish we would have gotten a second Blackrock Mountain in the form of Batol. I just wish the storylines were finished because I would love to know what the OG story beats were meant to be. But don't let me rant or I'll be here for way too long. We have one final thing to cover. Now, I already covered 5 raids and these raids all should have been in vanilla, but they sadly were not. But another thing that was meant to be in vanilla but just got scrapped was the Caverns of Time. Now, the Caverns of Time was meant to have a raid and it was meant to have multiple dungeons. We're not exactly sure what happened. I know a lot of developers actually hate Caverns of Time and what it's done to the lore and story. So the Caverns of Time for the most part is rather mysterious in its original intentions. Now we did get it in TBC, but the OG intentions were drastically more different. The Black Morass dungeon may have actually been the Black Morass raid, where you were meant to group up together and fight recurring bosses. So it would be boss 1 gets summoned, boss 2, boss 3, boss 4, boss 5, or there may have been another raid in the Caverns of Time location instead. I'm not exactly sure because no matter how much research I do, how many dev interviews I try to scrape, how many old forum posts and just YouTube videos I try to find, we don't actually know what the original raid idea in the Caverns of Time was meant to be. but there was meant to be a raid there, and I don't know what the original intention was. So let me know in the comments below what raid or dungeon you would love to see most in a Classic Plus or in a future expansion, for example, the War Within or Midnight. Thank you all for watching. If you liked this video, please like and subscribe. If you hated this video, like and subscribe anyways. There's no point being a half-assed hater. Be dedicated. Thank you all. Ebonheart out.